Welcome back to the Writers Craft Summit. In this session, I'm speaking with Joan Dempsey. Joan, welcome to the summit.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I'm glad to be here, and hi, everybody.
Now, since you and I have last spoken on my podcast, your book, This Is How It Begins, came out and has been a huge success. So congratulations. I've been watching along through social media, all the great award nominations and the fantastic response you've been getting. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It's really been fun after so many years of writing. It's a real kick to have it out there in the world and, you know, be hearing from readers all the time. It's a blast.
Now, in this session, we're going to dig into the topic of self-editing. So tell the viewers here a little bit of what the heck is self-editing?
Sure. Well, you know, one of the things that as a writer, I love the process of revision. Those people who are watching who have followed me for years know that I've tried to carve a little niche out of the whole idea of revising with confidence, because for me as a writer, the first draft is only one tiny part of the entire process. So self-editing and revising comes once you've got the basic stuff down on the page, whether it's just a chapter or an entire book or an entire story. And all of that editing, in my view, is where the magic happens, or a different kind of magic, I could say. You know, certainly in the first draft, there's a lot of magic that happens. But in the process of self-editing, everything gets deeper and more clear. And so that magic is really about deepening the work that you do. Self-editing in my book is critical, because by the time you get to a point where you are sharing with readers or a publisher or an agent, you want that work to be as polished as it possibly can be. So self-editing is critical so that you make sure that you tick off all of the boxes of things that those people will be looking for when they're judging your work. So that's sort of the nutshell.
And if you're self-publishing, your editing is going to be one of your biggest expenses up front. So the more you can self-edit, the better shape it's in. Even when you bring it to an editor, it's probably going to be cheaper, because most freelance editors are charging by the amount of time they spend, or estimated amount of time they're going to spend on your manuscript. So if you come in with a really beautifully self-edited, really polished manuscript, your editor is going to have a quicker time. It's going to save you money.
Yeah, not just save you money, but I think the other thing, especially if you're self-publishing, there are fewer checks along the way on your work. So you want to make it as good as you can so that editor then can really be looking at polishing to perfection, as opposed to cleaning up a whole lot of stuff that really should have been cleaned up sooner. Because what that means then is that, like, if you share with an editor a really rough product, then and I do a ton of editing, I read a ton of manuscripts. You know, what you would be using my time for then is a lot of stuff that if you'd done it yourself, your final product would have been much better. Because if it comes to me clean, we can talk about the story and the characters in a lot more depth than if the sentences are a mess or the grammar is, you know, in need of polishing, etc. So lots of good reasons to know how to self-edit your work right out of the gate.
Absolutely. Now, when I'm working with my coaching clients, often we're working on things around mindset during the drafting process. There's a lot of mindset issues going on, as you know, throughout the writing process. And there's a certain approach I try to get my authors into when they're drafting. But I think sometimes there's a switch that needs to go on when you move into the revisions phase. So can you tell me a little bit about what you would recommend the proper mindset is when it comes to self-editing?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. And I think the one thing I see time and time again, and it always surprises me, is that sometimes writers feel like once they put something on the page, they're golden. And I think of those folks as more of would-be writers than writers. You know, writers put something on the page and then spend a huge amount of time changing what's there. And so what I recommend with people is that they embrace the opportunity to make the writing better instead of resisting that. I mean, it's not uncommon to have people with 6 novels that they've written and they've cranked them out, you know, or like 2 trilogies. And they've never gone back and edited either one. Well, those folks are not going to become writers in the sense of, being full-fledged writers. There are folks who want to be writers but don't do the hard work after that. So I think it's important to take an honest look at whether you're willing to put in the hard work. It's a tough question, but I think it's really important. The other thing I want to stress is that, in this, I think particularly right now, the idea of doing a, quote, shitty first draft has become such a thing, that's the only way to write a draft, is to just crank it out as fast as you possibly can. A lot of people do it in November with National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. But it's also not wrong to self-edit and revise your work as you write. I have a lot of writers who come to me and they say it sort of embarrassed, like it's their little secret that I revise as I go. And that's how I write. I do not write a shitty first draft. By the time my first draft is done, I'm more at like a 12th draft because I have revised as I've gone. So many writers find great relief when I say it's fine if you want to edit as you go. There's really no one right way. So I think that's really important, is for people to understand that whatever works for them to do the work is what they should do. And that sort of goes along with what I always say, which is there are no rules. There is no one right way to do it. There are as many ways to write and revise as there are writers. You just really need to find what's working for you, tune out all the other advice that's saying, well, you're doing it wrong, and go for it, because it's hard enough to stay at the writing desk without imposing all this stuff on yourself about the right way that it should be done. The other piece I would say is that a lot of times when people begin to revise their work and get into the editing phase, they get really overwhelmed because there are just so many moving parts. And like anything else, I always say, just do one thing. Worry about this one character. Kevin Johns is the star of this novel. Worry about Kevin, and then worry about everybody else. So really take one thing at a time, and that will help with that feeling of overwhelmedness.
When an author is working with a editor, often one of the things that the editor is bringing to the table is a new, fresh set of eyes, some objective point of view, distance from that of the author. That sometimes the editor could see something that was right in front of the writer's face, but they were blind to it. So what can a writer do who's going to be self-editing to get that level of objectivity that you need to be able to really look at your work in that distanced manner?
Yeah, that's so important, is to be able to get some distance yourself before you hand it over to an editor. It's always great to have somebody else read. I mean, that's one of the best ways to get distance, is to work with somebody else who can sort of mirror your work back to you. One of the things I love to do, and I do this all the time, is I read my work aloud all the time. I do it as I'm writing, but I also do it like, say I've finished a story, maybe I'll let it sit for a little while, and then I'll come back and read it out loud and I hear something. I've also had other people read my work to me, and that can be a scary process when you're working with a draft, but it's enormously valuable because, if you, Kevin, read my work to me, I would hear things that I wouldn't just from myself, because you would bring a different perspective to the work. So that's one thing I really recommend, is get somebody else to read your work to you. And of course, now online, you can have a computer program read to you, put in your work. And in some ways that's even better because it takes out all the affect, so it's very flat and very drab, and you really have to focus on just the words because there's no inflection. So that's one really good way to get distance. There's the proverbial stick it in a drawer. Leave it in a drawer for a month, or 2 weeks or 6 months, whatever you can afford to do, and then you always see new things when you come back to it. Some other smaller sort of tricky things are if you literally hang your pages, and this is tough if you have a novel or a memoir or something, but if you put up a clothesline and hang your pages up, you can see when you have like big chunks of exposition, like really dense prose, or when you have pages and pages and pages of dialogue, and it just shakes up your perspective enough to get you to think about what's there on the page. You can also lay things down on the floor. It's funny, in one of the online classes I teach, we were talking about this and how cumbersome it can be because, you know, you're laying all these pages out, and I have so many photographs of people with a cat lying in the middle of the pages on the floor when somebody's walking around looking at their pages. Another very simple thing you can do is use a different font. You know, if you're a Times New Roman person, put it in Calibri or Helvetica or something like that. It's surprising what you see just from that small thing. You can do it on the screen, you can print it out, you know, something like that. Let me see, I've got a little cheat sheet over here.
Well, it's so interesting. Just even in the last 6 or 7 years that I've been coaching, I think when I started, almost everyone was printing at some point. But I find lately, a lot of my clients now are working in the cloud, they're working off of tablets, and they never actually print it. And as you said, it can be so effective for getting a different view on things, reading that paper copy.
Oh, I completely agree. I would never not print my work, I have to say, you know, and I usually wait until I have a really big chunk of work done. I'm a novelist, so, you know, I wouldn't do that necessarily for a chapter, but once I get a big chunk, I always print it out because you're absolutely right. You know, if you're looking at the printed word, you're reading it much more like you would a book as opposed to the project that you're used to seeing up on your screen. Another thing that's kind of related to that, and I think of this as going to a foreign environment. You know, if you're always used to working at your kitchen table, you know, go to the library, go to the coffee shop, you know, go to your bedroom, go to a friend's cabin, whatever you need to do to shake up the place that you are, not only changes the distractions that you have around you, but just gives you a new environment from which to look at your work. And I think that also is really helpful. One thing, a student in a former online class of mine, he did this thing that I'd never heard of, and I tried it myself, which is he would, let's say he has a short story, in order to see each sentence through fresh eyes, he would go to the end of his story and look at that final sentence just as a sentence on its own, and then go to the next one and the next one. So he was like working his way backwards. Mm-hmm. And what that does is it strips away the context within which the sentence lies within the story, and you can look at it as a sentence. Now, other students in the class were like, yeah, but you're not going to do that with a novel. And I think that's true. You know, that would be helpful if you're having trouble on a particular paragraph or, you know, something like that. But doing editing backwards in that way can be helpful. So there are a lot of different things you can do just to shake up your brain is really what you're doing. Yeah.
Something I find that people struggle with when they're trying to do some revisions is this idea of the macro and the micro and going back and forth between these kind of big picture things and smaller details. Could you speak a bit to this idea of we've kind of got things functioning on two different levels here?
Yeah, we really do have things functioning on two different levels. And the macro, of course, is the big picture of you know, and I always think novel because I'm a novelist. It does, I'm not trying to discount anybody else, but really you're thinking about the major players, the characters or the people in your book, the plot, the point of view, the theme, the structure, all of those big things. And then, of course, the micro stuff, on the other hand, is all sentence level stuff, you know, where the sentence is working and there's a lot of stuff within that. Getting back to what I said earlier about sort of there are no rules, I really believe that too when you're self-editing. And I can talk about these 4 different approaches that I have seen that a lot of people do. But I think there is this idea that you really should start with the big picture and work your way down to the smaller stuff. And I know a lot of people who feel very strongly about that because they say, I don't want to muck with my commas if it turns out that my theme is wrong. And I totally get that. And I still maintain that whatever you have to do to get yourself into the work is what you should do. So if commas is what you feel like doing today, you should do commas rather than doing nothing at all. But there is always that interplay between the macro and the micro. I mean, you might write a sentence one day and there's something within that sentence that changes the entire thing that has led up to what you're doing now. So I think there's constantly this back and forth and this interplay between the macro and micro. I think it's very difficult to separate the two, but they do contain very different elements.
I think that's one of the things that I love so much about self-editing and revisions is this idea that when you're drafting, you've basically got to tell the story. Like, you've got to sit down and write that chapter that doesn't exist, whether you feel like it or not that day. Whereas when it comes to revisions, I feel like working on dialogue today, so I'm going to work on dialogue. Or it could be a comma day, and there's so much more flexibility to go with where your interest lies or where you have energy that day, or, the amount of time. Oh, I only have 20 minutes to work on it today. Well, I'm going to look at this little thing. It's so freeing, I think, to get through that first draft and then be able to say, like, there's so many different things I can work on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It really is freeing, and that's part of what I love about it. And in the 4 approaches that I mostly see people use, I call what you're just talking about the scattershot approach. Mm-hmm. And that totally works for me, which is, where is my energy today? How much time do I have? Do I feel like working on commas? Do I feel like, exploring my theme and making sure it's all, what do I want to do? And so that's like popping around amidst all of the different things that you have to do. So I call that the scattershot approach. There are some people who would absolutely not do well with that and really need a much more structured approach. So one of the 4 approaches I call the usual approach is that whole, like, starting with the macro, making sure the story and the characters and everything is all set, and then going down to the micro editing at the sentence level. Some people absolutely have to do that. So that's one approach. Then there's the inverted approach, which is people who love the minutia and they love the sentence level stuff, and they feel like without those sentences being in great shape, the bigger macro stuff can't work well. So they might start with the smaller stuff and work up to the big stuff. And then, of course, there's scattershot. And then there are some people who are such linear thinkers that they will take, like, chapter 1, macro to micro, chapter 2, macro to micro. So those are the 4 that I see most commonly that people tend to do. And really, again, it just depends on who you are and what kind of personality you are and what works best for you. Like I said before, I'll keep driving that home. Whatever works best for you is what you should be doing.
Yeah, I'm absolutely the macro to micro, upside down pyramid approach. But as you said, other approaches work for other people. And the thing I always watch out for is what I call, like, whirlpool syndrome, where this keep revising the same scene or the same chapter until the end of time. When I'm working with my clients, I say, I don't care whether you're doing scattershot or whether you're going macro to micro or whatever, as long as you get out of that whirlpool and move on to the next scene and the next scene.
Absolutely. And there is a difference between somebody who gets stuck in chapter 1 because they feel like they need to know something to write chapter 2, and the person who's just stuck in chapter 1 and is in that whirlpool. And this as well as I do. And, when you're coaching people in that, you have to be able to tell that difference. Maybe there is something they have to figure out before they move on. And maybe it's just a way to stay in chapter 1 and not move on.
Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah. Well, as we're coming to the end here, maybe could we give people some specific things to look for when they're self-editing their work? Maybe some things that you've seen come up time and time again that writers should be keeping an eye out for?
Sure. And you probably know this too, Kevin. There are definitely things that I see over and over and over again. And I think at some point I categorize them, and there are like 15 of them, and I'm not going to share 15 of them, but I'll share sort of the top ones that I see repeatedly. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a manuscript draft in progress where I haven't seen these things. So one of those is, what I say about this is, don't simultaneously show and tell. Everybody's heard about show and tell. You have to make sure you're showing what's happening, don't tell what's happening. But both showing and telling have their place. But what I see time and again is people who show something beautifully and then also tell. So for instance, and this won't be showing it beautifully, but just as an example, something like her shoulders were shuddering, the tears were dripping down onto her plate, and she put a hand over her eyes. She was so sad. Right. So, so you've shown that she's sad, and then you go ahead and say she was so sad. Yeah. I see that repeatedly. And I think part of what that is that the showing is a lot of fun to write. And then the telling is sort of like, well, in case I didn't quite do the showing well, let me also tell you. And it makes complete sense that, especially with newer writers, that they would do that. So I see that constantly. And it's part of the learning curve there. And once you learn not to do that, you'll probably never do it again once you get into the practice. But very, very important to make sure you don't show and tell. Readers don't like it.
I see something pretty similar. It might even be the exact same issue when they'll describe something in the narration and then describe it again in dialogue. So it'll be, and then they all got onto the boat. Boy, this sure is a big boat that we're on. That's right.
That's exactly the same thing. That's exactly the same thing. Why not just say, boy, this is a big boat we're on, and forget about they got onto the boat, through the dialogue. That's the showing piece. So absolutely. Another thing I see is an overuse of dialogue tags. We are in a time right now where it's really standard and customary to stick with said and asked, and to use them as minimally as possible. Now, this didn't always used to be the style, but it is currently the style. It used to be that people would be murmuring and bellowing and shouting, and and that's still possible to do that, but it's not as in vogue. Mm-hmm. The other piece of that, though, is that I see far, far, far too many dialogue tags. Blah, 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 he said, blah, 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 she said, blah, 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 she said. It just goes on and on and on. And I think the important thing to clean up your prose, lean prose is strong prose. So if you can get rid of those unnecessary tags, it really cleans things up. And if somebody has that habit, typically their narrative is littered with way too many dialogue tags. Mm. So if you strip those out, it makes a very big difference.
Is your preference to just delete them or to replace them with an action instead? She sipped her coffee and continued. Yeah,
no, that's a great question. I would say it depends, because another thing that I see commonly, I'm sure you see this too, is that sometimes you'll get dialogue action, dialogue action, dialogue action, dialogue action. And I think that's just as bad as dialogue she said, dialogue he said, because it creates this back and forth that interrupts the forward flow. Yeah. So action is absolutely critical, but if you overdo it, like anything else, it can clutter things up and slow things down. In fact, one of the other things I see that I was going to mention is this idea of action versus activity. So action is, like you said, sips her coffee, although this is tea. So, if I'm writing a story about me and within that I'm sipping my tea, that sip of tea really needs to mean something. It needs to be more than just an activity that the character is doing. Far, far, far too often, characters are always smoking, or they're always messing with their hair. And a lot of that stuff ends up being activity, which is just something they're doing. But if you have somebody who's, say, smoking a cigarette in order to not talk, let's say they're having a conversation with somebody and they're keeping something from that person, that's a good reason to put a cigarette in somebody's mouth, but not just randomly have them smoking to do something. I'm not sure if I'm making that clear, but action is something that has depth. Activity is just doing anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're touching on a bit of like the concept of Chekhov's gun, right? Like Chekhov said, if you have a gun on the wall in Act 1, it should be fired in Act 2. It's that idea. Exactly. If you're going to draw attention to something, there better be a reason for it. There better be some payoff or some deeper meaning. Yeah, I think that was.
Yeah, exactly. So another example would be if somebody is in a conversation with someone and they really want to get away from it. you could show them stumbling toward the door as they're talking. So they're moving out of the scene. That is showing the reader something about what's happening. But if that same scene happened and the character did something like, rubbed a hand over his nose, what does that mean? So, every word on the page has to have meaning behind it. And what's one other one? There's one other one that I see all the time too. And this is when it's, let's see, how do I describe this? Okay, let's say that you, Kevin, are the star of this novel that I'm writing, and it's in third person point of view from Kevin's point of view.
Kevin, I love that I'm the star of all your example novels.
I know. Isn't that great? Maybe I'll put you in my next novel.
I feel very heroic today. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all right. So let's say, we're firmly in Kevin's point of view, and Kevin is organizing an online craft conference, and you know that Kevin's the guy. You don't want to say, Kevin set up the interview with Joan, and he noticed that she was wearing a plaid shirt with a black jacket. You don't need that he noticed, because you're in Kevin's point of view. You can just say, Kevin set up the interview with Joan. She was wearing a plaid shirt and a black jacket. And you know that it's Kevin who's noticing that because you're in his point of view. It's called filtering when you do the he noticed or he saw or he looked. And you don't need to do that. If you're firmly in the character's point of view, you don't have to include the fact that he's noticing, just have him notice. Similarly with if the character Kevin is having a thought, you don't need to say something like, the sound of those birds made Kevin think about the time when he was a boy and he was out in the park. Because you're in Kevin's point of view, you just say, Kevin thought about that time in the park. And you know that you don't have to lead the reader to hear that. So that's another one I see all the time, is a lot of leading the reader to a thought or to what the character is seeing.
Absolutely. I think it might have been you who introduced me to the term filtering for that.
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, and ever since then, I see it everywhere for sure. So
yes.
Thank
and
you.
It wasn't me, by the way. It was John Gardner in The Art of Fiction. So I don't get full credit for that.
Well, Joan, I know you really are a complete expert on all aspects of the revisions process. So if people want to learn more about self-editing and revision, where can we send them to learn more about that?
Yeah, sure. The best place to find me is my website, which is joandempsey.com. Within there, I have a section that's just called resources, and there are a lot of free things I have online, links to articles on craft, links to book that I recommend on the craft of writing. I also do teach online classes. Some of those are kind of free teasers for master classes. I do have a self-editing master class, writing great dialogue master class. This year I'll also be doing a writing great characters master class. So those are all online, and you can learn more about them again at joandempsey.com.
Well, Joan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me on this summit. I'm sure I don't need to tell you, self-editing is such an important aspect of the craft. And so I was so thrilled to have you here to share your excellent knowledge with our viewers.
Well, always happy to talk with you, Kevin, and enjoy the rest of the summit, everybody. This is going to be fun to see the rest of the presentations.